We want to welcome everybody to tonight's The LaRouche Organization Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for Thursday, October 7th. 35 years ago, yesterday, there was an attempt to assassinate Lyndon and Helga LaRouche. That was not successful. And this assassination attempt involved some 400 federal, state, and local law enforcement personnel. This had occurred in Leesburg, Virginia, and the attack was thwarted in various ways and for various reasons, most notably Lyndon LaRouche's direct intervention to inform members of the Reagan administration who were familiar with him and had met with him, some of whom were involved in the actions that led to the Strategic Defense Initiative of 1983, that were there to be any killing of him, that blood would be on the hands of the Reagan administration. The troops were pulled back, the law enforcement officials were pulled back, and that process was the announcement of what would be a railroading of Lyndon LaRouche and an attempt to crush this organization and his ideas. That was unsuccessful, but there was a reason that occurred. And tonight, one of the things we're going to be doing is talking about that reason, but by way of posing the alternative to that kind of a scenario. We have a pamphlet, which I believe many of you have received, and if you haven't, we're asking you to get it and help us distribute it. It's called The Coming U.S. Economic Miracle on the New Silk Road. The Coming U.S. Economic Miracle on the New Silk Road. We're not selling the pamphlet. What we're doing is we are distributing the pamphlet, and we are requesting that people contribute so that we have the ability to reprint the pamphlet continually. It's in 14 sections, and the sections are all actually suitable for teaching. And there's a conversation going on among us about the idea of providing for a kind of class series with that pamphlet, precisely so that for a change, what we're going to do is challenge not just the American people, but in particular the American people, to put up a shut-up. Often people are talking about what they consider to be these extraordinary problems of various types, but they're not really willing to do anything about the problems. They say they are, but in our case, what we believe in doing is, and you've seen this because many of you have met us out in the street yourself, we go out and we organize, and we propose, work through alternatives that can give a direction, a path forward for human society. This is something that Lyndon LaRouche pioneered, he championed, and when he organized his organization some 55 years ago, he insisted on separating the serious young people with whom he was interacting from the blowhards, the agents, and just the people who were the despairing, the existentialists, who really were going to go by the boards. You know, back in those days, you could have large movements of literally hundreds of thousands of people out on the street, and then they would evaporate because those people actually weren't serious. They might have been seriously reacting to something, but they had no conception of responding to the great questions of the day. And that's exactly what we're here to talk about tonight. So I want to only indicate one area in which you want to know about a discussion. If you've been to the gas pump, or if you've paid attention to your electrical bill, or if you're talking to people in Europe, particularly in Great Britain, you know that there are 5-mile, 7-mile long gas lines going on right now in London. If you happen to know people in countries like Hungary or Albania or Romania or any of those places, you're hearing about the impending electricity shortages. If you know people in Italy, you know that the price of electricity went up 30% last week, 30%. And if you happen to be involved in the shipping business, you know that the price of shipping a container, for example, from Shanghai to Los Angeles tripled in the last 12 months. It went up 326%, up to now $10,500 plus per container. So now what this is, some people refer to it as hyperinflation, and it is that. But what this is the beginning down payment bill on the Green New Deal. Yeah, that whole thing that they've been telling you about climate change and how good it's going to be for you and how important it is for the planet that you start to pay $1,000 to $2,000 a month electricity bills. And the issue is that whether people are going to go along with this or whether they're going to fight. Well, today, or I should say yesterday, Vladimir Putin was talking to people in Europe, in the European Union countries, and he had this to say about what was going on this matter with energy. He said, the global energy market does not tolerate hectic moves and vagaries. Putin is speaking in particular about what he sees as speculation on the market. He said, investment plans in this area are long-term. Therefore, any abrupt and rash action may lead, and judging by the current market situation, are already leading to serious imbalances like those we are seeing in the European market that has been affected this year by several unfavorable factors all at once. Now, he's not saying that this is caused by COVID, by the way. He's saying that there's speculation and there are ways that people are trying to manipulate the global circumstance, which has been influenced by COVID. He says the practices of our European partners are to blame. These practices have reaffirmed that, properly speaking, they have made mistakes. All of its we have been talking with the former European Commission. All of its activities were aimed at curtailing the so-called long-term contracts and transitioning to gas exchange trading. So what's happening? Basically, in anticipation that there actually might be a move out of carbon, in other words, people might actually be serious about we're not going to use oil, we're not going to use natural gas, we're not going to use gasoline for that matter. What's, of course, happened is that there's rabid speculation going on. Things like the Amsterdam spot market for oil, or speculation at Wall Street, or speculation at the City of London. And so the thing called the Green New Deal is the Green Raw Deal. And the Raw Deal is now about to hit you right directly in the pocket, because what this is really about is population reduction in the short term. And that population reduction is not just going to be in poor countries in Africa or something. It's not really powered by what people keep calling simple racism or something. That may be a factor, but that's not what powers, the people of the planet. That powers certain of the institutions of the planet. And because the reason for that is because there's been enforced poverty in sections of the globe, and then in some sections of the globe, they have finally won. They've resisted that. China used to be occupied by 8 different nations at the same time, about 120 years ago. It was more colonized than any country in Africa. And what has happened is that it now represents the second largest economy in the world. Let's remember one other thing, just talking about Russia. Remember that the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And then it was supposed to be under Yeltsin, who was the big friend of Margaret Thatcher, big friend of George Bush. It was supposed to see this giant revolution that was supposed to happen, and was going to be led by the free market. And Americans were all over Russia. People forget this or like to forget it. It was called shock therapy. There's an article that just came out called, I'll tell you the name of the article in a minute, but here's what the article says at the beginning. It's all a quote. It says, it was supposed to be the greatest transition of modern times, practically overnight, a dirty, inefficient, and unjust system that encompassed 11 time zones was to undergo an extreme makeover. This is the shock therapy of Jeffrey Sachs and Robert Strauss and people like that from America. Billions of dollars were available to speed the process. a new crew of transition experts came up with the blueprint, and the public was overwhelmingly on board. Best of all, this great leap forward would serve as a model for all countries desperate to exit a failed status quo. So remember this? Go back in your mind, 20 years ago exactly. What actually happened? They say that's not what happened. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and Russia emerged from its wreckage as the largest successor state, government officials in the newly elected administration of Boris Yeltsin teamed up with a cadre of foreign experts to chart a path into a post-Soviet system of democracy and free markets. The West offered billions of dollars, blah, blah, blah. With all these sources, Russia could have become an enormous Sweden of the East. Instead, Russia suffered an economic catastrophe, the equivalent of $20 to $25 billion leaving the country every year. It goes on about other things. Let me also point out it suffered a demographic catastrophe. There were 1 million less Russians each year between those years of 1991 and 98 approximately. And it went from being the second largest economy in the world to now it's just outside of the top 10. It's like number 11. That was done by the great Western free marketeers. That's who did it. They created oligarchs in Russia. That's what they did. So what are you looking at right now? What are you looking at right now in Europe? What are you looking at right now in America? What is the Green New Deal really? It's your version of shock therapy. Now the shock therapy is going to be done on you and me, or we're going to stop it. Now, with that said, we have this pamphlet, as I said, that has come out, and the pamphlet has these various sections, and we've talked about doing educationals on this. Tonight what we want to do is to give a kind of an idea about some elements of the pamphlet, which might be considered by some people to be either more difficult or less familiar, but are at the very core of the entire premise of what we're putting forward. And to present that, we want to have Megan Beats do this. Megan is the president of the United States second chapter of the Schiller Institute. She's also done a lot of work historically with LaRouche and the science team. And so she's here to talk about some of the sections of the pamphlet that she'll outline and delineate. So, Megan?
Okay, thanks a lot. So just to reiterate where Dennis just left off, the effect of this hyperinflation, if sane and moral forces like us don't intervene, will be the complete and intentional expropriation of the population, exactly as happened in Germany following World War I. That's something that Helga LaRouche reiterated on Monday of this week, and she put out a call for a unified international mobilization against the hyperinflationary looting policy, which can only be stopped by the steps that Lyndon LaRouche outlined in 2014 in a document called The 4 New Laws to Save the USA Now. And in that document, LaRouche outlines 4 steps, the only possible steps to be taken to stop that onrushing collapse. Number 1, the immediate reenactment of the Glass-Steagall Law, instituted by U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt without modification as to principle of action. Step 2, a return to a system of top-down and thoroughly defined national banking. Step 3, to acknowledge that the purpose of the use of a federal credit system is to generate high productivity trends in improvement of employment, with the accompanying intention to increase the physical economic productivity and the standard of living of the persons and households of the U.S. And 4, adopt a fusion driver crash program. Now, after outlining those 4 laws, those 4 steps, in the first half of this document, and it's a quite short document, in the second half, LaRouche takes up very succinctly the underlying principle of the entire thing, and that is, what is the nature of man? what makes human beings different, better than animals. Now, as Dennis mentioned, alongside this call that Helga put out for a mobilization against this hyperinflation with the 4 laws, the LaRouche organization just released this blockbuster pamphlet. And in that pamphlet, not coincidentally, you can find the outline of LaRouche's 4 laws. Now, here in this location last week, we had Jason Ross and Chris Sayre on to discuss with you all the content of the pamphlet, to give you an overview of why this pamphlet wasn't just a nice, cute thing to do, but it is a necessary policy intervention now that must be deployed rapidly and with great confidence and competency across the United States, internationally as well. So as Dennis said, I want to continue that theme that we took up last week on the pamphlet by going into the last couple of sections of the pamphlet, mainly one of the last sections on nuclear power and nuclear fusion, which, as you heard, just happened to be the 4th law of LaRouche's 4 laws to adopt a fusion crash program. And that's perhaps the most, even though it came 4th in the list, it's perhaps the most fundamental and primary of those steps that LaRouche outlined. Now, why? Well, quite simply, because the dedication to a crash program for fusion and also space development today deal with the future. Where is humankind going? To where are we progressing? Are we progressing? You cannot be a competent leader today, and you certainly can't be a qualified citizen if you aren't willing to do the work to envision where humanity must go over the next 50, 100, 500 years, and then to organize your life, your limited, finite life, to make that happen. Now, all of the leadership, and frankly almost all of the citizens in the West, the so-called transatlantic sectors today, don't believe in the future. It's a meaningless concept. They try not to think about it. No one in position of leadership today, except for us and people we've found to work with, is actively trying to create a future. And this is the result of everything that Lyndon LaRouche said over many decades about the baby boomer, 68er, rock, sex, drugs, counterculture coming home to roost. And actually, I was recalling earlier today, in 2012, Lyndon LaRouche, in a discussion, Lyndon LaRouche really went after the American population. And now, you all know that Americans love to complain about their elected officials, love to complain about Congress. They're the problem, right? But LaRouche really went after the American population, specifically from the standpoint of the future. And he said that if you don't have a long-term vision for the future of humanity that you're committed to over many generations, then you are not moral. You have no morality. And he said, for that reason, the oligarchy is more moral than the majority of our citizens. Now, why? Because now evil as it may be, they have a vision of the future that they are and have been committed to over many generations. Yes, it's an evil vision, but it's the kind of commitment that you don't find in very many of our citizens nowadays. Now, that, not the oligarchy, not the evil part, but that really is the secret to so-called politics and political intervention. It's not any of this left-right political party garbage. It's not the kind of populist or local politics. It's not this my neighborhood, these my neighborhood kind of issues that people get pulled into. Lyndon LaRouche proved with his very long and potent life that he, as a private citizen, had more to do with determining the direction of human history than 99% of elected officials today. And what he proved is that you cannot change politics unless you come at it from a sense of the truth about humanity. Not local issues, not power politics, not money. Only if you act on your sense of the truth of the nature of man and where humanity has to go, will you be able to see, to discern the efficient pathway to move human society forward, and therefore to recruit the kind of allies that LaRouche recruited throughout his very long life, which included the presidents of nations. Now, that truth about humanity is that we are not beasts. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that we as a species are inherently and by nature good. We express a principle of the universe that nothing else that we are aware of does. So I just wanted to quote Lyndon LaRouche from that document, The Four Laws, discussing this. He says, "The knowable measure in principle of the difference between man and all among the lower forms of life is found in what has been usefully regarded as the naturally upward evolution of the human species, in contrast to all other known categories of living species. The standard of measurement of these compared relationships is that mankind is enabled to evolve upward, and that categorically by those voluntarily noetic or cognitive powers of the human individual will." So what LaRouche is describing is not a humanity which is a bunch of victims of the powers that be, the poor slobs who are the victims at the whim of the gods of Mount Olympus. He's describing Promethean man. Now, LaRouche was an economist. In physical economic terms, this Promethean quality of man expresses itself in what LaRouche referred to many times as the domain of physical chemistry. The physical chemistry of humanity's activity. Now, mankind, throughout our existence as mankind, has existed, has been able to exist because we wield fire. No animal does this. We intentionally cultivate and apply different forms of fire to alter nature around us, to bend it to serve our needs and improve the universe at large. Now, what form that fire takes is very much dependent on our current state of knowledge or belief about what it is that makes up the universe. Now, to give a little bit more meat to those bones, with early man, you could imagine the hypothetical hunting and gathering type society, humanity applied fire to change the physical state of materials. Obviously, you had early campfire type situations, cooking of food, which is very important. A little later, we applied fire to the science of metallurgy. Early man was able to use fire to turn rocks ore into metals. Now later, much later, we applied our understanding of the natural world and our understanding of chemistry, that no longer were we just limited to altering the physical state of matter, but we could alter materials based on their chemical properties, creating new substances. We applied that form of fire to develop powers, which range from the use of coal and oil for energy to the creation of unique materials, plastics, chemical fertilizers, and so forth. Now, beyond that chemical domain is the domain of the atomic nucleus, in which we act and shape not just the molecular or chemical properties of materials, but we act to shape the nucleus itself. Now, we'll get back to that, but if you think of this process over time, from very early man up until today, not surprisingly, along with this development of our understanding of nature, our mastery of nature, came a consequent rise in the human population. We went from a few tens of millions of human individuals living very short lives to 8 billion people living on the planet today with much longer lifespans and a much higher overall quality of life. This is our reward, so to speak, and this is beautiful. Now, completely opposed to that is the outlook of troglodytes of the old paradigm, such as Prince Charles, Mark Carney, Tony Blair of perpetual war fame, who are actively today pushing the fascist austerity and depopulation policy that Dennis outlined to try to save their system, to try to save this system of oligarchy. And how are they doing it? By looting the population. Now, one example, Exhibit A, so to speak, is Klaus Schwab. Now, Klaus Schwab is the head of the Davos World Economic Forum, and he has a proclivity to write books. And one of his most recent books, called Stakeholder Capitalism, A Global Economy That Works for Progress, People, and the Planet. So in this book, he says that, yes, industrial and scientific progress, these are the reason why people today have been able to achieve a better living standard and longer lives. But, he says, we now know that this destroys the planet and therefore must be reversed. And he then promises that he and his financial elite compatriots are putting together a new and more powerful framework to choke off credit to businesses and industries engaging in such terrible practices as industrial and scientific progress. So that's the fight. Now, back to our pamphlet. Near the end of the pamphlet, you have two sections. One of them, which I'm not going to touch on in detail tonight, but maybe we could do that in a future discussion, is called Our Mission in Space. What is a crash program? Now, the one I do want to talk about just a little bit more tonight is called Nuclear Fusion, Power for the Future. Now, people on this call may or maybe not be familiar with the concept of nuclear power. Today, when people say nuclear power, you hear about a nuclear power plant. What we're talking about is a process called nuclear fission, the splitting of the atom. Now, this, if we think back to what I outlined just a minute ago, this change from physical to chemical to nuclear. In the nuclear domain, we have humanity acting in a completely different way than ever before in our history. And this is a change which came about fairly rapidly, beginning in the second half of the 19th century and then into the early 20th century, when our concept of matter and energy changed from one of fundamentally chemical substance, the chemical elements being primary, to a notion of the changeable nuclear atomic nucleus. Now, With nuclear fission, the splitting of the atom, we take a heavy element, uranium is the most common, and we cause it to undergo a transformation, which results in two or more lighter pieces, lighter elements. Now, the funny thing about this nuclear process is that, normally, like in everyday life, if you break something, if you split something apart, like, if you crumbled up a cookie or something like that, and you were able to contain all the pieces, all the crumbs of that cookie, and you weighed those pieces, the mass of all the pieces together would be equal to the mass of your original cookie, or whatever object you want to think of. This is not the case with nuclear processes. There's a discrepancy. We take that nucleus of uranium and we split it apart, and the pieces that we're left with together weigh less than the original nucleus we started with. So another way to say that, a more simple way to say that, is that in the case of nuclear processes, 2 plus 2 is a little bit less than 4. So where did that mass go? What's important about that? Well, what's important about that is that we get to the work of Einstein, who had the insight to foresee that part of what is being measured as mass is convertible into, or can be released into, a relatively enormous amount of energy. That's what we harness in a nuclear power plant. The energy released from nuclear fission reactions is tens of millions of times greater per reaction than burning a molecule of natural gas. So let me say that again. The amount of energy released per reaction from nuclear fission is tens of millions of times greater than that of burning a molecule of gas. So another way we could say that is, or picture it, I guess, is that the amount of energy carried in a single nuclear fuel pellet about the size of your finger, that amount of potential energy in there is the equivalent of 1 ton of coal. So I think this is incredibly astounding. Here you have human beings acting upon a new hypothesis, a relatively new hypothesis about the nature of the universe, acting upon something which we have never and cannot see. We have never seen an atomic nucleus. We don't know for sure what it, quote unquote, looks like. We have an image, sort of a heuristic image that we've created of its configuration. But by acting upon that immaterial notion, that concept of the nucleus, we're able to release energies many orders of magnitude greater than anything possible with with the powers we had before in the chemical realm. And when we do that, we get a nod from the universe, a confirmation that the universe agrees with us. Now, I just want to pause and mention here, but not go into it, that about nuclear in the United States, nuclear power plants. In 1990, the United States had 112 nuclear reactors. Today, we have 93. Or it might even be 92. I think I had a slightly outdated figure. And there are plans to shut down several more within the next year or two. Now, is that because these nuclear reactors are old and they've outlasted their lifespan? No. Actually, some of them were just recently renewed for several more decades. The reason these power plants are being shut down is because there's a Malthusian intention to halt population growth, to loot the population, and because of the sustained brainwashing of the population against nuclear waste and nuclear accidents, which is completely absurd, which has allowed this to happen. And I know there are several of you on this call probably that have been involved in fighting to save some of those nuclear reactors. So anyway, that's a bit of an aside, but I thought it was important to mention. So that's nuclear fission. Now, in our pamphlet, we talk about fission, but we also talk about nuclear fusion. Nuclear fusion is different. As opposed to fission, where we take a heavy atom and we split it apart to create smaller ones and a release of energy. With nuclear fusion, we take elements all the way on the other side of the periodic table, very light elements, usually hydrogen or helium, and we put them together to yield a larger nucleus with an even larger release of energy. Now, seemingly we have the inverse of fission, but as the work over many decades in fusion has come to discover, you're not talking about a simple reversal of a process. You're talking about something completely different. Now, just to back up a sec, nuclear fusion is not a terrestrial process, at least not quote-unquote naturally. Fusion is the process which powers our sun. And what we're doing with fusion research, is bringing something which occurs in bodies such as the sun and finding ways to recreate those conditions on the surface of Earth. And just to give you a quick sense, one little sense of what I mean, the temperature of the center of our sun is about 15 million degrees Celsius. The temperature inside of a fusion reactor, now the figure I'm going to give is specifically one in China, is 120 million degrees, getting near 10 times the temperature of the center of our sun. So with fusion, we're bringing this solar, celestial process to Earth to do work for man. Now, why is achieving fusion so important? So not only is fusion fuel an order of magnitude more energy dense than fission, and I already told you what fission, how powerful fission fuel is in comparison to chemical, but the fuel for fusion, at least for the first generation fusion power plants, is hydrogen, the kind of heavy hydrogen that is in abundance in seawater. And in case anybody hasn't noticed, we're not exactly running short of seawater on planet Earth. And that fact led, in the 1950s, when fusion research really started gearing up around the world, that led the head of the Indian Atomic Energy Commission, whose name was Homi Bhabha, to say this. So he said this in 1955, I believe. He said, "I venture to predict that a method will be found for liberating fusion energy in a controlled manner within the next 2 decades. When that happens, the energy problems of the world will have been solved forever, for the fuel will be as plentiful as the heavy hydrogen in the oceans." Now, he was predicting that we would achieve fusion in the 1970s. We haven't yet, at least not as a power source. We know how to make fusion happen. We have done it in many different ways. You have teenagers in their basements building little fusion experiments to fuse elements together. But we've never achieved a fusion reaction which yielded more energy than it took to create the reaction in the first place, what they call break even. Now, there's a lot of work being done around the world on this, including in the United States. There are very large-scale fusion projects underway in the United States at some of our national laboratories, similar types of facilities in countries like the United Kingdom, South Korea, China, Japan. There's a very large international project which is based in France called ITER. And all of those large projects are mainly focused on 2 or 3 kind of mainstream design concepts. One of them is called a tokamak, which is it comes from a Russian word or a combination of Russian words, but it's a concept to confine the fusion reaction within basically a big metal donut, a big metal torus. There's another concept called a stellarator, which looks kind of like a twisted donut, which uses magnetic fields and in a different kind of way. And then there's also a mainstream concept which is quite different, which uses lasers to kind of drive and smash the nuclear fuel together. Now you also, in addition to those very large, very exciting projects, you also have many smaller scale projects, some of which are private ventures, and I'll get to that in a sec, some of them working with mainstream ideas, but some of them experimenting with some not so mainstream concepts. And some of these concepts in particular come from the people who worked with Lyndon LaRouche and our organization in the 1980s in the Fusion Energy Foundation. These are people like Dr. Winston Bostic, Dr. Dan Wells, people who were thinking through how to use the behavior of fusion plasmas themselves, which in normal fusion designs, as you heat up the fusion fuel, it becomes more and more unstable. Well, there are certain designs thinking through how can we use the natural behavior of the fusion fuel plasma itself to our advantage, such that when we heat it up, it actually becomes more stable. It's self-organizing. So you have some very exciting work being done by companies in New Jersey and California on that. You also have a different kind of approach by a small company in Massachusetts that's working with MIT using new kinds of superconducting magnets. You have a company in Canada which is working to collapse a wall of liquid metal onto a fusion fuel target. One experiment I want to mention in particular is that of a company in New Jersey, which is working very closely with the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab, one of our national labs. And the experiment that they're working on is a fusion reactor concept called the Princeton Direct Fusion Drive. And the idea is not only an energy-producing fusion reactor, but the idea is to produce a fusion rocket. So the design is about a 30-foot long cylinder, which uses a combination of hydrogen fuel, but also a very special kind of fuel called helium-3. So helium-3 it's just an isotope of helium. It's a helium which has one less neutron than quote-unquote normal helium. And I want to mention this particular experiment for two reasons. Number one, by using this combination of fuels, particularly the helium-3, the byproducts of the fusion reaction are all charged particles. Okay, now that's not the case with some of the other fusion experiments. In this case, all the products are charged particles, which is important because a charged particle can be contained and controlled with magnetic fields. And in this fusion rocket design, we use magnetic fields to send all of those charged particles flying out the back, one end of the cylinder, to create rocket thrust. And what this could allow us to do, at least in potential, is to travel efficiently in very short, relatively short amounts of time to the far reaches of the solar system. For example, traveling to Mars in a couple of weeks rather than months. This would completely change our concept of time and distance in the solar system. It would open up our solar system for exploration, for colonization, something which is impossible today with chemical fuels. So that's one reason I wanted to mention it. The second reason, which is related, that I want to mention this experiment is particularly this fuel, helium-3. So while Lyndon LaRouche was very excited about the idea of this helium-3 fuel. Part of the reason is that helium-3 is not abundant on Earth. There's very little of it available to us on Earth. So you might say, well, your concept doesn't seem very practical, does it? But there is literally tons of helium-3 waiting for us on the surface of the moon. So you kind of have to let your mind get enticed a little bit to wonder or to think of the fact that, yes, fusion is found in the sun. It's a solar process, but it's also a lunar process. And this means that the moon, in a sense, is waiting for us to turn it into a base for further exploration of the solar system, to industrialize and settle it. So I just obviously very quickly gave you the most sketchy idea of the work being done around the world, but you have thousands of people around the world still doing incredible work toward achieving controlled nuclear fusion. Now, the question I posed tonight and the question we implicitly pose in our pamphlet is, what is your intention for our future? Now, in some countries, like China, for example, they are dedicated to graduating hundreds of fusion scientists from their universities and graduate programs every year. That's not the case in the United States. That's not the case in European countries. In the United States, we've cut funding year after year to fusion since the early 1980s. And that's caused the shutdown of very promising programs, very promising machines, and the dispersion of very talented teams of people. Now, I do want to mention that in this fiscal year 2021, because of some very dogged work on Capitol Hill, the magnetic fusion budget went up just a little bit, which is good. However, just to give you some perspective, the total fusion budget of the United States is still 1/10,000th of the defense and intelligence budgets. So it kind of raises the question of, or I guess it ought to pose the question to us of which is actually more important for the future security of the United States and world population. So that's why our pamphlet, and you all on this call digging into to really know these topics in depth, is so important. We're at a moment, an open moment, where we have a chance to decide what the future of humanity ought to look like and to fight for that. And as was expressed in that quotation from Homi Bhabha that I read earlier, mastery of nuclear fusion would liberate all of humanity from any current limits to growth. And that's exactly what John F. Kennedy called for in his inaugural address, which we quote in the introduction to the pamphlet. When Kennedy called, in the middle of, you all know what time period this was, Kennedy called on all nations to come together to fight our common enemies: tyranny, poverty, disease, and war. Now that outlook, that Promethean outlook, was echoed. I just want to end, or almost end, by reading two more quotations. One is from the 1950s and one is from this decade, or last decade. So in 1954, the head of the United States Atomic Energy Commission, a man named Lewis Strauss, he said this of nuclear fusion. He said, "Our children will enjoy in their homes electrical energy too cheap to meter. It's not too much to expect that our children will know about great periodic regional famines in the world only as matters of history. They will travel effortlessly over the seas and under them and through the air with a minimum of danger and at great speeds. And they will experience a lifespan far longer than ours. as disease yields, and man comes to understand what causes him to age. So that was his outlook with the promise of fusion power. Now, the last one I'll read here is from a man named Ouyang Zhiyuan, and he is known as the father of the Chinese lunar program. And he said this, it was about 5-6 years ago. I might be a little off on that, but sometime in the recent few years. He said this, and he's talking about helium-3 here. He said, "It's estimated that reserves of helium-3 across Earth amount to just 15 tons, while 100 tons of helium-3 will be needed each year if nuclear fusion technology is applied to meet global energy demand. The Moon, on the other hand, has reserves estimated at between 1 and 5 million tons. This could solve humanity's energy problems for around 10,000 years at least." So I just want to leave you with this. I want you to turn your thoughts to the question of Haiti and Afghanistan. And I want you to think of the devastation there. Think of the conditions of life. But there's no reason that within a short amount of time, both of these nations can't and shouldn't become premier centers of fusion and space research. So that's our mission. That's why you have to get our pamphlet if you haven't already. You have to help us not just distribute it, organize with it. And as Dennis said, we're planning to organize, we're in discussions to organize a series of educationals for you all, but also people that you know need to be educated on this to turn us very quickly into the kind of political organizing force that can turn the tide in this very crucial moment.